Yeah.
Well, what do you think about that? Is that
Also, that's true. More so as last.
Okay, let's begin. Recite Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah. Any questions from last week? Could take them. Try. So last week we talked a little bit about Aristotle, and we haven't actually gotten through all of Aristotle, which makes sense because it's vast. But if there's anything that you feel like was said last week that you're somewhat confused about, or at least can't make sense of in the sense of, moving forward from this point on, then speak now or forever hold your peace. Let me share the screen real quick. So we got through talking about this diagram, the method of science for Aristotle, and I think that we left off on the reductio ad absurdum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, salama. Welcome, welcome. So from here, what needs to be discussed then is Aristotle's attack on the Platonic theory of forms. So you remember what we said about the Platonic theory of forms, right? That for Plato, there was an idea of the forms. Some would like to call it the capital F forms in contrast to lowercase f forms. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but the idea was that there is an non-spatio-temporal realities that have existence outside of the world that inform and ground the reality of those things as they're instantiated in the world, which is the reason why we come to know the difference between human being and tree. Okay. Now, given what we've said about Aristotle at this point, I think it would be smart for us to give somewhat of an understanding as to what Plato had postulated, and then from there see what exactly Aristotle is going to say. So Plato basically attempts to do what Aristotle himself was interested in, which is to give an explanation of why something had to be the way that it is. For example, why is that thing a human being versus something else? Now, Plato posits that this thing is a human being because it participates in the capital F form of human being. Now, Aristotle is somewhat unhappy with the concept of participation. He finds this to be extremely unclear, and what he wants to show is that it really doesn't explain anything at all. And the way that he's going to show this is through this particular model here. Okay. Now, to Aristotle, the form is supposed to explain why it is that we call some thing or things by the same name. And as a matter of fact, it's the essence of what that thing is. But that name or essence must also apply to the form itself, because it is the thing that instances of the form have in common with one another. So for example, let's think about humans, okay? Think about all the human beings in the world. Now, Plato says that those things are human because they resemble the perfect human, okay? So the perfect human is on top there. So then we ask, okay, well, is the perfect human itself human? And the answer is, well, isn't it an abstraction? Does he believe that these things exist in the mind? Or does he believe that these things actually have existence? Yes.
The human is human.
Okay. Yeah, so there is this perfect human that exists, that grounds the instantiations of us as humans, that allow for us to be able to see one another and say human, human, cat, human, and differentiate. Okay. Now here's what he's showing is that, well, is the form human, this perfect human, alongside those instantiations of that form in the world, now a separate category of things that you have to explain for? Does that make sense? So we have this new group, all of the objects and the form, the perfect human. So what explains what all of those things have in common? And so he'll say, well, then you need another category that explains for those, i.e. another human, perfect human, more perfect human. And now that has also created a separate category. And so that then continues on ad infinitum. All right? So do you see what he's pointing out here? That this idea that seeks to try and explain for why things are the way that they are, in reality doesn't explain for anything. So we continually have these new groups, all the objects and the forms that they belong to, which creates its own group that a form then has to explain for, and then you have to explain for that group separate to it, so on and so forth, ad infinitum. And at the end, what you have is an infinite regress. Okay? Since there's no end to the regress, we never get an explanation for why humans differ from dogs or cats. So we're simply told that they resemble something that resembles something that resembles something ad infinitum. This is what has been historically noted as Aristotle's third man argument. And the third man argument is supposed to show that Plato's forms doesn't actually accomplish its goal. So he rejects Plato's metaphysics and ontology, the forms with a capital F. He also, by the way, rejects atomism, the idea of void, for example, the atoms in the void, is for him contradictory, as it implies that what does not exist exists, basically. And Aristotle denies this because to him that's a contradiction. Obviously, it's a contradiction. He asserts that everything is filled at every point. So, for example, the space between you and me is filled with air. Okay, every space is filled likewise, whether we can see it or not. And he also rejects atomism because the world under this particular cosmological model wouldn't be explainable. I.e., if it were true, you couldn't say why the stuff around us must be the way that it is, i.e., why it's necessarily that way, given my understanding of the world itself. Since according to atomism, everything is just a result of chance or something beyond the world. So you couldn't say why a dog, for example, has to be a dog. You couldn't say that there's some particular essence that dogs have. It posits a type of arbitrary world, i.e., you could say that atoms were posited in an arbitrary manner, and they came together to form the things that we come to see and come to understand. They don't have to be like that and could disperse. Now, obviously, for Aristotle, that's going to be extremely problematic if he's trying to create a theoretical vision of the world vis-a-vis what he knows of the world. And so this view he sees as being at odds with the way that the world actually works, i.e. the world for him is ordered, law-governed, and it works according to necessary laws which describe the way that the world must work at any given time. Okay, so the point is, Aristotle has to start over And starting over involves him giving an alternative metaphysical system, which he then coins the four causes. Okay, has anybody here ever taken the four causes? Now, what exactly is he trying to do? So Aristotle agrees that we want knowledge of essences, which again, that's what Plato was after as well. The forms are essences. He likewise has a theory of forms that you can distinguish by calling it the lowercase f forms. But his forms are in the objects around us. So he agrees that there is some property that every and all dogs have, which makes them dogs, as opposed to something else. But he doesn't think that the form is somehow separate from the object. Okay, and in one version, which I think is probably a much more sound understanding of this, as you'll come to see, for him, it's not that there are separate, for Aristotle, it's not that there is one being or a unified reality that informs what things are. For him, ultimately, there are gradations of reality that could be said of existence. Okay. It's deep, but it's something that those who know it, I wanted to put that out there. All right. All objects are composed of two parts. Number one, for Aristotle, you have the form and you have matter. So form is that which shapes the matter, matter out of which the objects are constructed. So a dog, for example, is composed of a particular dog, some material informed by the form of the dog, but the form is in the particular instantiation itself for Aristotle. So these two things are separate in thought, but not in reality, as he would put it. Aristotle thinks that, for example, each red object has the very same form of redness, i.e. a red ball contains the two things, redness and ball, okay? But it's a mistake to think that the redness could exist independently of the object itself, i.e. the ball. The property of being red is located inside the object. So the form for him is located inside of these objects. Now this leads to some difficulties because he's forced to say that the very same form of these things is simultaneously located all over the place, which sounds a bit strange to some, but Aristotle is absolutely fine with it. So again, for each red object, okay, we can separate the redness, the form of red, from the material. But this is an ability that the mind has. They don't actually exist apart from the objects that are instantiated by it. So they can only exist together. And this is what becomes known as hylomorphism, which is just a fancy word for saying that there are two things here, the form and material. And for Aristotle, Plato's mistake was to think that these forms somehow existed apart from the objects that they're located in. But still, the form of red is real thing for him. It exists as part of the object. And by the way, this also becomes part of his response to Parmenides. He's going to argue that change consists in material coming to have a form. So the very notion of becoming is going to be a very Aristotelian concept that these things didn't have before, right? And this is going to solve a lot of problems for him. Okay, now remember, from before, we started talking about, to really know something, Aristotle thinks that you must be able to, number one, explain why the thing has to be the way that it is and cannot be any other way. And that is, we need to be able to give the reasons why that change happened and cannot be some other way. And so the word Aristotle uses is atia, or which is translated as cause. And that's a little bit misleading to modern people because for us, he doesn't mean cause in that sense. What he means is the reasons why the thing happened the way that it did, or is the way that it is, okay? And this should inform us then as to what exactly he's after. So the first example up here, okay? That's Socrates, by the way. You all knew that, right? Yeah. I don't know if that's actually Socrates. And there's also this SMV, you were talking about it, right? Was he really real, or did he make, was he made up? It's probably real. This sculpture looks pretty real.
It's very melancholic.
Melancholic?
It's very melancholic.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's like facial expression.
Okay. He has a what?
And sit there for like hours.
Yeah. That's what melancholics are known for. I wouldn't know anything about that. So now, all right, looking at this sculpture, this is the way that Aristotle conceives of how we think of things, okay, through this version of the four causes. What are the reasons that this particular sculpture is the way that it is? That's the question that we're trying to answer. The sculpture is the result of a process, and Aristotle thinks has four causes which fully together explain why it is that way. And part of the answer is that it's made from a certain material. So for example, in this case, what do you guys think? Like marble? Yeah. Could be made of gold, could be made of silver, etc. Right? The other part is the shape that it has. Okay, so it resembles Socrates or some guy that we're calling Socrates. If it was shaped differently, like an Aristotle shape, then it would be called someone else, right? So the shape in this case, the form, partly explains why it is the way that it is. But of course, part of the answer also involves a person who sculpted it in order to achieve some end product, i.e. the sculptor, okay? So there are four things, causes, which explain why something is what it is and must behave the way that it does in order for us to come into an understanding of what it actually is. Okay, so the material is the thing that is the same before and after the change, i.e. in every instance of the change, there's an object that remains the same throughout that process. So in this case, we said it's marble, right? The formal cause is the thing that actually changes. Like, what's the difference? So that which is different before and after the change. So for example, the shape of the marble. The efficient cause is just the thing that initiates or does the changing. So for example, in this case, it's the sculptor. And then the final cause, he says, that for the sake of which change is done. So Aristotle believes everything happens for a purpose. He's teleologically oriented. And the final cause is the image or the finished product that the sculptor has in mind. In every case of change, there is some material which is receiving some form, which is being put there by some agent in order to achieve the purpose that the agent has, i.e. the final product, okay? So, and you can do this with everything. So here's a table, right? The material causes what? Wood, with which the table is made. It's the material cause of the existence of a table, right? It's something that is needed and without which you just don't have a table. What's the formal cause? The shape. Exactly. So you got this square shape of the table, the legs, et cetera, et cetera. What's the efficient cause? Ostensibly. The fact, carpenter, right? Not me. My wife's really into that stuff though. She's out in the garage, like, a bunch of wood. She was trying to get Sidi Mehdi to help her figure out some stuff as well. And inshallah, the renovations are going well. And then the final cause. The final cause is that for the sake of which something's produced. So the table, right, for me to put my stuff on it and have something to place things on, and so on and so forth, right? You can eat on the table, that kind of thing. Now, part of the underlying notion of the four causes for Aristotle is that it sets up the grid, okay, this deterministic grid to provide him an explanation for everything. This is very important. If you don't understand anything that I just said, try to understand this point, okay? For him, what he has put together is this deterministic grid to provide an explanation for everything. Because for him, there is no such thing as random or arbitrariness to the world. There's only ignorance of the actual causes. So to sum it up, to give an explanation of change, Aristotle thinks that you need to specify all of these causes. So we just gave the example for sculpture. Why does a sculpture exist? Why is it the way that it is? Well, it was made out of certain material because it has a formal shape. The efficient cause, the artist did it, so on and so forth. Final cause to get a statue that has that certain shape. Now, what's important to realize in this is that the sculptor example can be somewhat misleading. Like when we think about this example, we can be led to think that material is stuff like wood and marble, and right? We can think that form is simply just shape and that efficient causes are simply just persons. But this is misleading according to Aristotle, because he thinks that, in fact, these categories apply to every process of change, including objects falling, planets moving, people walking, etc. Any process or change needs to be explained with these four causes. And what the causes are depend on what you're trying to explain. Okay, so notice that when we were earlier trying to explain why the statue is the way that it is, you know, suppose that we're trying to explain why the statue is red instead of simply just why it exists. Well, then you're going to get an entirely different set of four causes. Does that make sense? So the material in that case is the statue itself. The statue is the thing which is the same. So we don't talk about marble when trying to explain why the statue is red. Now, in general, Aristotle counts a substance as any kind of thing which can attribute properties to it. So, for example, you know, statues, cows, persons, couches, you know, other examples. Now, the formal cause has nothing to do with the shape in this particular instance, but rather it's the form of the color red being transformed into the material, right? Like the statue itself. Now, of course, there's got to be an efficient cause. So whoever, or we can even say whatever is applying the form is the efficient cause. So the process of some chemical reaction in this model. And then the final cause is related to the purpose, which is, you know, the process happens for XYZ reasons. So for example, if a person is painting, then it is the vision of that person that they're bringing to fruition. The formal talks about the property the thing acquires. The final, in this case, talks about how it acquires it. And so if you know what the formal cause is, you'll easily then know what the final cause is, okay? And you can do this over and over and over and over and over again. So for example, a pan. Heating a pan. How does the pan go from cold to hot in Aristotle's model? So what's the material cause in this model? The material cause. The pan itself. Put it up there. Assalamu alaikum. How are you? The formal cause is the heat. Okay. And Aristotle would say that the form of heat has been transmitted into the pan. All right. The efficient cause is the fire or something hot. Okay. And then final is to get a hot pan, which is related to the formal cause. This is an important point that, you know, if we had more time, we would stop and dwell on. We're not going to. But Aristotle introduces a distinction between something actually being a certain way and its potentially being a certain way. All right. And this is actually extremely important to understand in his model. So when the pan is actually cold, Aristotle will say that it is potentially hot. Why? Because it has that quwwa, that capacity within it. Okay. And what this means is that the material, i.e. the pan, is able to receive the form of heat. So potentiality for Aristotle, this is determined by the kinds of forms that a material is able to accept. So the pan is not potentially, say, an eagle, okay? Because the pan cannot accept the form of an eagle and then be an eagle, i.e. like the pan is an inanimate object and cannot be an eagle simply by transmitting the form of like eagleness into it. So an object is completely determined by the material, and which forms that material is how it is sort of seen as receptive to that thing and nothing else. So that didn't confuse you. Now, in order for this pan, let's say, to become actually hot, the pan needs to come into contact with something that is already actually hot. So in Aristotle's terminology, the thing must possess the form of heat already. And this thing then transmits or transfers the form to the material, thereby causing the pan to actually become hot. So notice in this example, by the way, heating up the pan, it's the fire which is the efficient cause, transferring into the pan, and not a person who's doing it, right? Like you're not transmitting the form of heat into the pan, but the thing which has the heat already in it. So in a sense, we can conclude that the properties, i.e. cold and hot, do exist in the same object. One is actual and one is potential. Now this solves the puzzle that we're discussing from before of how it is that you could explain how something changes, i.e. the heat didn't come from like nowhere. It came from the fire which had heat transmitted to the pan, and the heat was already in the pan in the form of a potential, of a quwwa, a capacity. Which means that the pan can accept the heat, and so you don't get something from nothing in this particular equation, right? So it's not the case that opposites really exist at the same place and the same time, except he'll say that one is potential and one is actual. All right? Here's another one. And this one is important because it's also going to segue into a different topic. Rocks falling to the ground. What explains this? Yeah. Here we go. You guys ready for this? Aristotle says the four causes explain everything. Okay, so it's the four causes. Now what we want to do is identify the thing that is remaining the same in this change, which will give us the material. So we have this rock. We let it go. It moves, according to him, in a straight line down to the ground. When it lands on the ground, is it still a rock? Still a rock. So the material then is what? The rock. In fact, Aristotle defines earth in general as objects which move in a straight line down to the ground. Okay, why? Because earth is composed of what? You get what I'm saying? So for him, this makes sense. And it's important to remember that Aristotle rejects atomism, and he endorses the older view that reality is composed of the five elements and have sets of complementary properties. Okay, so you have earth, water, air, fire, and ether. That's Navi's favorite element. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. I know you kind of touched on atomism. Maybe I'm forgetting, but I don't recall you going over atomism in prior classes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Atomism is a very interesting concept. Ultimately, what they're talking about is atoms in the void, that everything is reducible down to a indivisible part. So if you think about it, insofar as the way that they conceive of the world, they would say that the world is finite in this model, versus the idea that you can continuously ad infinitum divide the subatomic sort of particles to forever, thereby having kind of an infinite reality to the world. And that model would have been known as hylomorphism. There's a lot more that we can say about it, but the very basic understanding was that. By the way, it was theoretical. So for them, it wasn't something that was proven per se, right? They said, on the basis of this theoretical account, kind of like theoretical physics today, on the basis of this theoretical account, do you believe the world is finite or infinite? and then what that means in terms of the model that you're going to try and push out to make sense of reality. Yeah, there was a lot that was said on atomism. There are many people that have written on it in a variety of capacities. We'll talk about it again when we get to Sunni theology and the Mutakallimun. And, oftentimes atomism is used as kind of like this way of saying, oh, see, they believed in this and it was wrong because we know now that, the atom is not actually the smallest part. And so everything that you said on the basis of that premise is wrong. That's not what they were talking about. Like the idea that we now have like subatomic particles that somehow displaces this concept. An atom in Greek just means indivisible particle. So whether you're talking about an atom, which would have been much more in line linguistically with what it is that we're talking about, or a quark today, it doesn't really matter. What we're talking about here is an indivisible particle, whatever that is. Okay, now, the 5 elements. Earth. And by the way, these 5 elements constitute the entirety of the dispositions that exist in reality. So Earth, which has as its essential property, as we said, moving downwards towards the center, is constituted of cold and dry things. Water is constituted of cold and wet things. Air is hot and wet. So air, sort of in a sense, right? You can understand this, that it rises. It's not grounding. And so it's hot. And yet air is still, there's an element of it, right, that you could say sort of plays between earthly and samawati or airy types of realities. Versus fire, which is hot and dry. Okay. And then ether, assalamu alaikum, good to see you. Ether, which he thought of as a divine substance, which nothing on earth is made out of, but all of the heavenly planets are made out of this. And that's actually the reason why they just kind of hang there and don't collide with the world. Okay, they're kind of there, up there, hanging in this way. Now, this is obviously a very different view than what the atomists held or what we ourselves hold today. All of these elements for him are in the earth, in that they occupy a specific place in reality. So you have earth at the bottom, water on top of that, air on top of that, and then fire. And there's kind of a common sense reasoning in this ordering. So earth should be at the bottom because earth will move through other things. It moves through water and air and fire, but not vice versa. And fire, of course, is at the top because the natural movement of fire is upwards. So for Aristotle, each kind of thing in the world has a natural movement, something that it possesses by its very nature, i.e. earth moves down and fire moves up, right? Which can actually be viewed, like, and this is the point for him, is that it's empirically verifiable. Now, so the rock in this particular example, it falls because it's composed of earth. That's what it does. So the material is earth. The formal cause, what Aristotle calls the heavy, okay, simply the form for movement towards the center of the universe. Fire would be the opposite. The efficient cause in this is this rock possesses inside of itself the ability to move itself towards the center of the universe. Again, the heavy. And then the final, what is it doing it for? What's the purpose? Well, to be at the center of the universe. That's what it does, right? That's its objective in life, is to be at the center. And that's where the process stops and the goal ultimately is achieved in that sense. So these things, according to Aristotle, are not inert objects, okay? But things which possess abilities or capacities, like they're doing something. In the same way that we're doing something, so are these things doing something. So the rock moves towards the earth in order to be at the center, which is the natural place for earth. Now, of course, obviously this sounds weird to say that the rock has a purpose to be at the center of the universe, but for Aristotle, he sees something purposeful. He sees something acting to be at the center of the universe. And again, this is very different than the way that our theologians are going to think about this. All right. It's in the nature of earth to move downward. Now, water moves down as well, but not as much, right? So for example, when you put a rock in water, what happens? It sinks, right? But nothing falls through a rock, correct? So for him, this is indicative of something. Air moves up, and you can think about carbonation, right? Like bubbles moving up in liquids, like carbonation. For him, it's a natural phenomenon. And of course, fire moves upwards most of all. Now, Aristotle would have thought that everything in this world is composed of these elements. So think of wood, all right, like this table. It's composed of earth and air, according to Aristotle. Why? Well, it's got to be composed of earth because when you drop it, what happens? It falls in a straight line down to the ground. But it also has air because when you put it on water, what happens? It floats. So that must be, according to him, the upward movement of the air. So Aristotle says it must be constituted of a ratio of both earth and air. Like enough earth to fall straight downwards in this way, but not enough to sink in water. And from this, he sets out to know the ratios of various things. So for example, get 4 parts earth and 1 part air, it'll give you wood. And 3 parts this, 2 parts that, it'll give you what? And all of us, as a matter of fact, are also composed in this way, which brings about a particular disposition within us that also has a harmonious understanding with everything around us, right? So you have, in the same way that you have cold and dry realities to objects, you also have cold and dry aspects of the self as individuals, okay? Which brings about a melancholic reality, right? Someone like yours truly here, who kind of just wants to be in a corner with a book alone and doesn't do all that well with people sometimes. Alhamdulillah, I do better, right? Versus someone who's hot and wet, right? And these are people who, they thrive with people. They love to be around people. And these also have correlations to geography. There are places in this world that you can describe as being cold and dry or hot and dry or so on and so forth. And again, you would think of it as being constituted in this way if you're thinking about it from an Aristotelian perspective. Does everybody understand that? This becomes a primary model for a very long time of thinking about not only the world, but the human being, the self, the psyche, which then has an effect on the way that people think about medicine. So when someone came to you who was ill in the pre-modern period under this dominant model, you wouldn't simply just say, oh, take this pill, or right, the way that we treat today, which is much more invasive and seeks to try to treat the symptoms versus trying to holistically understand, well, what exactly is causing this? Going back to what the causes of things. So for them, they're thinking, okay, what type of individual is coming to me? Like, what is the composition of this individual vis-a-vis this model? What type of diet do they have? And maybe just simply just changing the diet might bring about this kind of equilibrium, which is ultimately what health is about. Health itself, the word, comes from the idea of whole, being whole, right? So if you talk to like someone like Sidi Hakim Archuleta, he'll talk to you constantly about this concept. And what we mean here is balance, that you recognize when you're out of balance and seek to implement those things that will bring about balance in your life. Homeopathic remedies understand this. Naturopathic remedies understand this. I mean, there are entire sort of philosophies and expansive amounts of literature that have been written to make sense of this. And I would say, honestly, the world that we live in today, most people are very aware that Western medicine is insufficient to treat a lot of the issues that we have. Right? And I think it's because of this that there is a much more profound awareness of this model. Most people don't really know this model, though. They kind of like fake it till they make it, in a sense. And some of our teachers will say you have a lot of people, even overseas, who are just turmeric doctors, right? So, oh, what's wrong? Oh, here's some juice, and there's a bunch of turmeric in it. Because turmeric just seems to be like this magical potion that does everything for you. Kind of is, to be real. Turmeric is really amazing. But no, you have to have an extensive amount of knowledge of understanding, actually is constituted in this way. Now, for us as Sunni Muslims, okay, the question is always like, how do we think about these things? We'll get to that. But to give you kind of a general lay of the land, we think of it in terms of hukum adi. It's an empirical judgment. There's causes and effects in the same way that there are causes and effects for anything else. If it works and it's not somehow explicitly counter the Sharia, bismillah. And to be honest, you will find that there is a lot of benefit in exploring some of these models. Again, like I said before, you have to be aware because there's a lot of charlatans out there who simply just give you a bunch of turmeric juice and tell you to be on your way. So do your homework. Now, so does that make sense? Is everybody good on this point here? All right. So just to sum up, Aristotle, he also gives, by the way, several examples to describe the way things move around here, okay? And they're all geometrically based. So one of his claims is heavier bodies will fall faster than lighter bodies, right? Which brings us into the laws of motion for Aristotle. So what he thinks is that if you drop a 100-pound weight and you drop a 10-pound weight, the 100-pound weight will hit the ground first. Which, well, if you think about it just from a sort of common sense perspective, you can say, okay, I guess I see where he's coming from. Yeah. I mean, because Aristotle thinks that the speed of an object is in direct proportion to the force that's applied to it. So he thinks the natural position of objects is at rest, and that because when you look around, they're at rest until and unless you move them. So he thinks that the natural position of an object is at rest, and that is because when you look around, they're at rest unless you've sort of forced them to do something. So objects don't move unless a force is applied to them, and the object stops moving when the force is removed. Okay, so you can see kind of, I'm just trying to give you an understanding of his philosophy. The last thing to note here is the speed of an object is inversely proportional to the density of the medium that it falls through. So for instance, the denser the medium, the slower the object goes. Like for example, through a rock, a rock through water, okay? Oh man, I lost it. A rock through water will slow it down. And through something like molasses, for example, you could say will slow down even more, right? Which is indicative of this particular model that he's trying to put forward. All right, now, yes, okay. Just to sum it up, his celestial vision. The planets for him move in perfect circles around the Earth, which is at the center of the universe. Why is the Earth at the center of the universe? Exactly. That's what it's doing here. That's its purpose. Now, why do the planets move in the ways that they do? Well, ultimately because they're made of SMV's favorite element, ether. Okay. which by nature, the essential component, moves in circles, right? Which is a divine movement, according to Aristotle. So for instance, the moon is made of this weird stuff, ether, because it doesn't move like the earth. It doesn't fall downwards towards the center of the universe. So Aristotle posits that the fact that the planets don't fall on us proves that they're made of ether, proves that they're made of something that we're not made of, which also for him shows why nothing on earth has a natural movement of circular motion. Okay. Which is a very interesting concept. Now, what's also really interesting, now again, I obviously have my critiques of this, okay? But there's something to be said about envisioning this particular conceptualization with the kinds of things that we know of in our religion. Like, for example, the tawaf around the Kaaba. There's this really amazing documentary. Do you know what I'm talking about? They showed the Kaaba and those at Hajj time where it's like packed, and you know the way that people circulate around the Kaaba and that motion in general, particularly when you're like, you know, 20,000 feet up looking down and all this is happening and you see it in this way. And then they contrasted that with the galaxies and the orbit of the planets. And what's interesting is that from far away, it's almost exactly the same thing. Right? And, you know, this is really powerful when you're thinking about it in a much more sort of poetic, allegorical way than obviously in the type of literal connotation. There's something to it. I mean, why were we told to make tawaf? So, Allahu A'lam. Any questions about Aristotle? Yeah.
I guess like, I guess just going through his ideas. It's like some of the stuff is like how we know is like true, right?
Right.
So then, but I guess we're just going through what he thought.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna go through, I guess, what most of them thought of what he thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Now, again, the reason why we went through this is because this particular model of reality is going to be a very dominant model of reality for quite some time. And even after, you know, Muslims integrate this material and begin to sift through it, and you know, well beyond someone like even Imam al-Ghazali, you'll see how a lot of these concepts in its more developed form, okay, are going to be thought of as simply the truth that cannot be denied. Yeah. Yeah, and part of the reason is because of Ibn Sina. You know, Ibn Sina takes this, develops it in a way that brings about a very rigorous academic grounding to it as well. I mean, I don't want you to hear the things that I'm saying and think like, haha, we're way past that today. You know, we are, but in many ways, he's also providing answers for very critical concepts. Now, part of what Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah provide to the world, as a matter of fact, is the fact that we invent this category called al-hukm al-adi, an empirical judgment. So when we talk about our foundations in Islamic studies, if you're doing it properly, you're going to be talking about the difference between a legal judgment, which is based on reports that then give us an understanding of revelation and the way that revelation operates. And you're going to talk about rational judgments, i.e., how the mind, the intellect itself functions, what's necessary, possible, and impossible, and that there isn't anything beyond that. And then hukum adi, empirical judgments, which are judgments that one understands the relationships between things as being patterns based on observation of repeated patterns in nature, for example, that give us an understanding that these two things hold, but not that one causes the other. Does that make sense? So when I let this go, okay, I let this go and it falls. I always wonder, like, one time I'm going to do this demonstration, it's not, you know, and everybody's like, whoa. They just walk out. Like, that's amazing mic drop moment, right? Like, I let this go and it falls down. That relationship we know of. We know of it. Why? Because observations of this particular demonstration has shown us that that is the result. That cause, that customary cause in relationship to that customary effect. Did I cause it to fall down? And see, that's the thing that most people, it's not really intuitive. I understand that. But at the same time, the model holds. And as a matter of fact, it will be the very basis behind which the scientific method is understood. Because what we're doing when we're looking at these relationships between things in the world is not substantiating any type of causality between two things. We're saying that there's a relationship that holds. You know, I put this particular object in the air, I let go of it, and there's falling. Did I cause that? I can't say that. All I know is that when these two things happen in congruence with one another, this effect comes about. Is that effect necessary? I.e., is it rationally necessary to happen, to hold? No, it's not. Right? And because of, and that's the whole category of hukum adi. Because we know that, if I'm going to tell you anything about the reality of the world itself, i.e. the extramental world, the physical world that we live in, it has to be based on observations and repeated patterns, tajriba, right? A kind of experimentation. It can't be on the basis of a priori knowledge that I have about the way that the world must function. And that insofar as this concept is concerned, I have to try and allow for my empirical observation of things in the world to match this particular concept that I have of it. That model of science is going to be stuck, particularly when things start behaving in ways that are completely counterintuitive to the principles that I've made about the world. Does that make sense? What's the only way out of it? The only way out of it is hukum adi. And the only people who were saying this, particularly in the 9th and 10th century, were Sunni Muslims. And as it develops, as you'll come to see, even the integration of philosophy into the Islamic world is going to have a huge influence on the way that Muslims themselves see what their project is to be. And those who correctly sifted philosophy in a way that was going to be beneficial for Muslims, and those who became somewhat beholden to this Aristotelian worldview, to the extent that they simply just said, look, if Ibn Sina said it, it's true. You know, and that's why those who came and wanted to develop on astronomy in ways that had absolutely nothing to do with Aristotle from amongst our tradition did so by simply saying, I don't need Aristotelian natural philosophy to explain astronomy. And from a religious perspective, I'm not like bound to it. I don't care, as a matter of fact. So long as I have observations and I'm able to build models that account for the data in the ways that I'm observing them, I can create those models. And if they hold, then we can change. And that would be expected, particularly of the world that can constantly change. And if I were to say that things necessarily cause one another in this Aristotelian fashion, what happens to miracles? Does fire necessarily burn now? It does, right? So when the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was thrown into the fire and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. How do you explain that if your model of the world is that fire necessarily burns? Like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. They have to interpret that verse of the Quran in a way that is completely outside of the very hermeneutics that we have in our tradition. They say, well, he wasn't thrown into the fire per se, he was thrown into an inhibiting force, right? And in fact, what you end up doing is having to explain away miracles. Versus the model that Ahl Sunnah put forward, which is something that maintains miracles. And as a matter of fact, it shows us that there's nothing strange about miracles whatsoever. The idea of a break in a conventional norm is something that could very well be the case. And so now you don't only have a way of substantiating what is happening in your scripture properly, but you also have a worldview that has provided intellectual grounding for miracles. So when people try to dog on us and say, oh, you believe that, the Prophet Muhammad went up on a winged horse like Dawkins did, or others who belittle these concepts, we have a way of saying, yeah, there's no problem with that, and providing this model. As a matter of fact, the very development of modern science itself owes its entire heritage to the concepts that were built on the basis of substantiating miracles by us. Isn't it interesting now that you're here mocking us? So we'll end on that note, inshallah, and take any questions, comments, concerns. Inshallah, next week, we'll get into the curriculum, and then we'll begin to talk about what did our scholars say of all of this? How did they sift through it? And in what ways does it actually become part and parcel of our tradition? Yeah.
Going back to the four causes, did you believe that everything had objects had one primary purpose and that's it, or did you believe that they had tertiary or secondary?
That's a good question. No, it would have been one purpose. That's why, the very idea of being a human, for example, there's one purpose there as well. Realizing your rational capacity and then reasoning and using that in order to connect to, as he'll come to show, as we'll show, the active intellect. Once you have more or less come into harmony with that, you see reality as it is. So being a human, ultimately realizing your potential as a human, means for him that you're intellecting in this manner. Yeah.
I guess you're saying I guess next week we're gonna see how these ideas sort of affected.
Yeah.
And these ideas, well, a lot of them hold true right now today, and some of them don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, with our faith, right?
Well, yeah, a lot of them don't. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So then I guess over time, were there things that back then held true but today don't, or vice versa? As things that will develop.
What do you mean?
I know, for example, the printing press, right? And that thing where it's at some point it was viewed as not halal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it was. So I guess kind of ongoing.
So you're talking about legally speaking, like something that goes from being haram to halal or things like that. Yeah, there's obviously going to be a lot of pushback even in regards to, as we'll come to see, Muslims engaging in philosophy at all. And then the extent of which you engage in philosophy, and then later on they kind of realize, oh, it's not really philosophy per se, it's how much you have adopted from the metaphysics of the philosophers and the principles and foundations that would be completely antithetical to our tradition. So, in that way, yes. Later on, you still have people who feel like, yeah, this integration is just too much for me. Famously, Ibn Khaldun has a passage in the Muqaddimah that says something along the lines of the subject matter of falsafa and kalam had become so intertwined that you couldn't distinguish one science from the other anymore. And that's true. The difference is that the mutakallimun were operating on the basis that everything that we're examining is being examined insofar as it leads us back to our understanding of God, his attributes, and his acts. Versus the falasifa who wanted to try and use existence as the subject matter to arrive at God. So there's a subtle difference there. In other words, the object of their inquiry is God. which means that the subject that they're examining, i.e. existence, is seen as being somehow separate from that at some level. And what they'll come to show, obviously, is that it all entails from God. Versus the mutakallimun are saying, no, what we're actually examining is the creation of God. Like that's what we're examining. Everything that ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, in order for us to be able to ground the claims that revelation tells us are true. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like they're broaching it from two different modalities. And because there's a lot of speculation as to what exactly is going on here, in the beginning, people say, don't do this, get away from it. And then later on, they kind of realize, oh, hold on a second. There's more ways to think about this, and these things could actually, in fact, be beneficial. As a matter of fact, they use it in a variety of sciences, not just theology. Anybody who does usul al-fiqh knows that this concept is going to be used. Logic, and then the discussions around logic being permissible or not permissible is also a discussion that's going to be had. And the ulama differ on this issue as well. But ultimately, it really goes back to the idea of who has properly conceptualized what's happening here over those who are trying to keep it, sort of play it safe and say, hey, we don't need to get involved in these particular ideas for XYZ reasons. Any other questions? Yeah.
Regards to like the signs of judgment day, how some of them are, we could say, contradictory to the letter of friends. It's kind of parallel to what's being spoken about.
How are they in contradiction to common science?
It's like the sun comes out from the other side. Well, I guess I'm important, but
Yeah. You answer that question. So what type of judgment is it to say that the moon rises from the east and sets in the west? Is that a rational judgment? It's an empirical judgment, right? Okay. So then is there anything absurd about saying that Allah wants to have it rise from the west and set in the east? No problem there.
Actually makes a lot of sense.
Sure. We can make it make sense.
No.
No problem. I mean, we can.
If you take it as like, you take what the narrations about like the universe being rolled up, right?
Okay.
Like, it would make sense for things to not make sense. Like, because if you're looking at it like a form of energy, for example, right? They call it the Great Crunch physics. Like the Great Crunch, one of the theories of it is that things will reverse at the beginning. And so it's not even like outside of like rational science. Empirical science that's happening.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't think of that.
Yeah.
In our time.
Right. I mean, the point that's fascinating things, but I think that the principle that we have that allows us to make sense of it properly is to say things that are empirically normative, okay, is different than saying something is rationally absurd or contradictory.
So can you say that it's rationally contradictory that sun rise?
Can you? See, if you did, then you would have to say at that point, yeah, now you have a big problem. Because somehow, quote unquote, science has deliberated on this issue that is providing rationally necessary judgments. And since it's providing rationally necessary judgment, what's a necessary judgment? Necessary is if you assume the opposite, a contradiction arises. So now you're going to have to say, well, somehow we also substantiate contradictions. And that would just be complete chaos, fawda. Oh, really? Because that, I exist, I don't exist. God is here, God's not here. That's saying, God can become a man, kill himself, come back to life. It's just all complete madness at that point. Why? Because, well, what's grounding any of the judgments that I make? Like, why couldn't any of those things happen? Well, because those things are contradictions. And for us, that is something that we take as being absolute. And it makes sense given that without it, we wouldn't be able to communicate anymore. Like nothing makes any sense. Like, in other words, you're validating skepticism. Okay, and I can just kind of like rant. Like what I'm saying right now would have no meaning or have as much meaning as me simply saying like golf, table, fish, chair, go back, like it's just, now it's complete nonsense, right? We're not saying anything. But that would be somehow synonymous with us saying the things that we're saying right now. Because there's no way for me to come into a proper understanding of anything. In order for me to have a basis of validating reality, I have to have principles by which I know I'm judging that reality soundly. So do I exist? Everybody here knows that. Why? Because it's self-evident. You see me, you recognize that you're not dreaming, like we're all good here, okay? In the very same way, we would say that contradiction operates to allow us to know whether or not we're thinking about things properly. And those judgments, insofar as they're rational judgments, can either be necessary, possible, or impossible. This one would fall into the possibility, correct. Sun rises from the west, possible. Sun doesn't rise at all, possible. Anything that is empirical, as a matter of fact, is in the realm of possibility. So, it's that which begins our conversation when we say, yeah, it contradicts science, but who cares? What's the basis of science? The basis of science is empirical observation. And those empirical observations are not necessarily, rationally necessary propositions.
Who popularized the world is a term? What philosopher?
What philosopher?
Like, who did it?
Well, I mean, you would have to say that the popularizer of that concept in general would have been Aristotle. The popularizer of philosophy in that sense is Aristotle. And yeah, this is going to be a main doctrine for him. So he does believe in God, or a necessary being. Except for him, the conception of what this is so vastly different than what theists are going to say about God. God has this like necessary relationship with the world, a kind of cause and effect thing. If God exists, then the world must exist. Therefore, you see my hand? See this ring? Okay, tell me what moves first. I remember I did that once and Hedger got like really mad at me. You remember that? Yeah. So what moved first? My hand. Who says ring? Brain. That's interesting. What moves first, Nilla? The hand. Why? Exactly. So there's causal priority that's given to the hand over the ring. And in that case, we would say that the hand moved first, even though they both actually moved at the same time. That's the way that the philosophers think about God and the world. That they're both eternal, it's just God is causally prior. So they're ontologically coterminous, but God is causally prior to the world. So that's obviously for us, Ghazali spells this out, saying, well, God choose to create the world at this point? No, what choice is there to be made? As a matter of fact, he doesn't choose anything at all. We're all here necessarily as an entailment of God existing. So there is no more fa'al lima yurid. What does he do exactly that he chooses? He doesn't choose anything. هو يفعل ما يشاء ويختار. He does what he wills and chooses. So you can't make sense of these verses of the Quran anymore given that particular worldview. Does that make sense?
Did you explain the difference between empirical and rational?
Okay, yeah. So empirical judgments are judgments that are made about the relationship between things in the world. They're based on observations of repeated patterns. So you could say, the relationship that this object has with me letting it go, or fire and burning, so on and so forth. Those relationships are relationships that we understand as cause and effect relationships. And the ulama will say that there are 4 types of empirical judgments, and they go into it. A rational judgment is a judgment that you conclude without having to empirically verify it whatsoever. You don't need empiricism. And there are 3 types of rational judgments, and those judgments allow you to know whether or not a proposition is necessary, i.e., it must be this way and cannot be any other way, or is impossible, meaning that if you assume it to be that way, a contradiction would arise, or whether or not you assume it to be the case or not assume it to be the case, no contradiction arises, i.e., it would be possible. Okay, so when I say, for example, that 1 is half of 2, how did you come to that understanding? Is that true, first and foremost? 1 is half of 2?
1 is half of 2. Yes, that's true.
It's true. Yes, one is half of 2. It's because I'm drinking this cold brew. That's 1 is half of 2, right?
Oh, it is, yes.
Yes, yeah. If it's not a quarter after 8 p.m. on a Wednesday, yeah. 1 is half of 2. How do you know that that's true?
I could say it's just evident, but you can also say
It is evident, yeah.
1 is equal to 1 half times 2 also.
Right. So in other words, did everybody see what Asnavi just did? I mean, it's somewhat indicative of the rational judgment. He kind of just went like that. Okay. What is he doing? Yeah, there's something going on that has nothing to do with the world. It's separate from the extramental world. He's abstracting concepts that then provide necessary conclusions. So when I say 1 + 1 = 2, that's not something that you know because you empirically verify that 1 + 1 is 2. I mean, you can. Like you can say, I have 1 phone and I have another 1 phone and I put them together, I have 2 phones. Okay, sure. But you wouldn't assume somehow that you need to test that with books and to know whether or not it's going to hold. I put 1 book and okay, that's 2 books. Does it work with oranges? No, it just works universally, unilaterally across the board with everything, right? So you talk about it as an abstract concept that then provides a necessary conclusion, and you come to know that void of ever having to see it. So there are things that you can know vis-a-vis the mind, and you don't ever have to see it. And there are things that you have to base on your observations of those things. Right.
Could you argue that, like, as a young child, you have to see that, though, to then understand it?
No.
No.
Yeah, this is the big one, is that people think that there is this category of rational judgments, but you only can come to know the reality of those things after having empirically verified it, but you don't. So, for example, someone has, a family member who's blind. Do they still have the ability to come into a proper rational understanding of the world? They do, even if they've never seen anything in their life. Then you say, well, they've sense perceived things or whatnot, but this is a category that stands beyond the realm of empiricism categorically. Now you can say, well, you still have to teach a human being language in order for them to have proper conceptualizations of things and that kind of stuff. Yes, okay, I'm with you there. To make sense of those things properly. But that's language. And by the way, language for us is not something that's creating meanings. Those meanings exist, void of whether or not we have a means of language to communicate those things to each other. I mean, I can see it even in my son. He knows certain realities. He doesn't no idea how to communicate those things though. So over time, he begins to realize, okay, there's a method to me trying to particularize what it is that I'm actually coming into contact with, these realities. Al-ma'ani qabl al-mabani, that's what the ulama would say. You know, there are meanings prior to the indications of those meanings. And so language is important because it's ultimately capturing what those realities are. But we're not like circumscribing language in a way that then somehow creates meanings. This is very important, by the way, for the world that we live in today, where people like the pronoun issue and all of these things that people really feel very passionately about. Whereas if they had a proper philosophical worldview, they would recognize those meanings exist void of whether or not you think language is capturing it or not. You know what I mean? And you can try and force people to use a particular type of language because you believe that that's going to create reality. In reality, it's not. You're sort of, you know, you're going to hit a dead end. And inshallah, it's sooner rather than later because it's going to create a lot of problems. But, oh, okay. Let's close up then. Barakallahu feekum. Oh, we'll stay behind a little bit afterwards. Inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us a good understanding of our religion, to allow our way to be the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and those who followed him and those who followed him بإذن ta'ala. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا ولك الحمد كالذي نقول وخير مما نقول ولك الحمد كالذي تقول ولك الحمد على كل حال. اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. اللهم يا الله يا الله يا الله بجاه أسماء الله وكتاب الله ورسول الله وأنبياء الله والصالحين من عباد الله. اللهم اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا. نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. اللهم إنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم ارزقنا حسن الخاتمة. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. يا عالم السر منا لا تهتك ستر عنا وعافنا وعفو عنا وكلنا حيث كنا. واجعل آخر كلامنا لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله كما يليق بكماله. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. I'm going to ask you all to also please recite Surah Al-Fatiha for Majid's father. Majid is someone who is very beloved to our community, and his wife Najwa, and his father just recently passed away. He's actually in Colombia right now for the burial process. So recite Surah Al-Fatiha for his father, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.